I never thought my story would begin this way, with fire in my chest and ice in my veins. But betrayal does that to you. It doesn't just break your heart, it reshapes you, makes you into someone you don't recognize when you look in the mirror. And sometimes it pushes you into places you never thought you'd go. When I first met Ryan, the world seemed brighter. Or maybe he was just good at convincing me it was. He walked into the room like he belonged everywhere, like the air bent around him. He had that kind of smile that made you forget where you were for a moment. That dangerous kind of charm that feels like a gift until you realize it's a trap. Everyone noticed him, but when his eyes landed on me, I thought foolishly maybe that I was the only one who mattered. We met at a small venue, one of those dimly lit bars where dreams still feel raw and unpolished. I was working backstage, organizing, making sure the performers had what they needed. He was there to perform, just another face on the lineup. But when he stepped up on stage, guitar slung across his body, confidence dripping from every move, I knew he wasn't like the others. And when he sang, it wasn't that his voice was perfect. It wasn't, but it was magnetic. Rough in places, smooth in others, like it carried scars and secrets he wasn't ready to share. I remember standing there, notebook in my hand, feeling like I was watching someone pull the stars down just for themselves. After his set, he found me. He always claimed it was fate, that he just happened to bump into me backstage, but part of me knows now it was intentional. Ryan always had a way of finding the person he needed most in a room. And that night, I was that person. You looked like you were really listening, he said, flashing that smile that made people forgive him before they even knew what for. I was, I admitted. My voice was steadier than my heart felt. From that moment, something began. He pulled me into his orbit so effortlessly that I didn't realize I was drifting. One coffee turned into late night talks. Late night talks turned into rehearsals, songwriting sessions, and plans for the future. Before I knew it, I wasn't just a girl who believed in him. I was the one stitching his dream. Together, piece by piece, I became his sounding board. His critic, his partner in every sense, except the one he bragged about on stage. He liked to pretend he was self-made, that every lyric, every chord, every connection was his. But behind the curtain, it was me, arranging meetings, tweaking his lyrics, networking quietly with people I'd met in the industry, and at first I didn't mind. I told myself it was love, that when you love someone, you help them rise. And when he said, "We'll do this together," I believed him. I believed every word, every promise. I didn't see the signs then. Or maybe I did, and I just didn't want to. The way he never introduced me as more than a friend when industry people were around. The way he accepted credit without once glancing back at me. The way his smile dimmed when I talked about my own music, my own dreams, as though the stage wasn't big enough for both of us. Still, I pushed those doubts aside. Love makes you foolish like that. It makes you fight for someone else's future while neglecting your own. And Ryan was a master at making me feel needed. He would call me late at night, panic in his voice, asking for help rewriting a song. He'd say he couldn't do this without me. He'd let me carry his burdens, but never share the glory. And I told myself it was temporary, that once he made it big, once we were secure, once the spotlight was strong enough, he'd turn around and pull me into it with him. But that moment never came. Instead, one evening changed everything. It was a night I'll never forget. Ryan had just finished a show, a small but packed venue where his name alone was enough to draw a crowd. He was riding high, his smile wide, sweat glistening on his forehead as fans screamed his name. I watched from backstage, proud but invisible, the way I always was. After the show, he invited me to the after party. Normally, I stayed behind, cleaning up, making sure his equipment was safe. But that night, he insisted. "You have to come," he said, grabbing my hand, that spark in his eyes. "You're part of this." And for a fleeting moment, I thought, maybe this is it. Maybe he's finally ready to let the world see me, to acknowledge me as more than a shadow. But the moment we walked in, I knew I was wrong. He let go of my hand almost immediately, slipping into the crowd like he belonged to everyone else but me. He mingled, laughed, and basked in the attention of strangers who only saw the shine, not the cracks. I stood off to the side, watching, my chest tight, trying not to feel the sting of being forgotten in a room full of people. And then I saw her. She was leaning close to him, her hand brushing his arm, her laugh too familiar for someone who had just met him. And he wasn't pulling away. He wasn't looking for me. He wasn't even pretending to care how it looked. I felt my stomach drop, my heart pounding in my ears. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But then I saw the way he looked at her, the way his smile softened, the way he leaned in, the way he used to look at me. And in that moment, the truth hit me like a wave crashing down. I wasn't his partner. I wasn't his equal. I was just a stepping stone, someone to carry him until he could stand on a bigger stage, someone to discard when he found a new spotlight to bask in. That was the night I realized I had been used. That was the night love turned into betrayal. I left the party without saying a word, my hands trembling, my chest heavy with something I couldn't name. Anger, sadness, shock, maybe all of it at once. I remember walking down the street, the city lights blurring through my tears, and thinking, how could I have been so blind? But betrayal has a way of sharpening you, of turning pain into clarity. And as much as it hurt, as much as it broke me, something inside me shifted that night. I swore to myself he would not walk away unscathed. He had built his dream on my back. He had used my hands, my words, my love, and claimed it all as his own. He thought I was weak, too invisible to fight back. But he forgot one thing. I had been there for every step of his rise. I knew every secret, every contact, every fragile thread holding his career together. And if I wanted to, I could pull them all. That was the night the fire started. The night I decided revenge wouldn't just be a fantasy whispered into my pillow. It would be real. It would be deliberate. And it would end his career. Because if he thought I was just a shadow, he was about to learn how dark shadows can really be. Asterisk. The days after that night were a kind of twilight, not quite daylight, not quite dark. I moved through them on autopilot, doing what needed to be done while my mind cataloged every slight, every omission, every sly smile that had once felt like warmth. He tried to act like nothing had happened, as if his hand on someone else's arm was a trivial misstep, as if the hours I'd spent fixing his demos and begging venues for him hadn't mattered. But the unease in my chest wouldn't let me sleep. It kept me awake, replaying moments until they were sharp edges. At first, I didn't want to plan revenge. I told myself I'd confront him, ask him to explain, demand the dignity of an answer. I imagined dramatic scenes, an explosive argument in a public place, a confrontation that would force him to look me in the eye and feel the gravity of his betrayal. But I'd already been in that kind of drama with him, messy, uncontrolled, satisfying only in the heat of the moment. That would have been emotional fire, loud and brief. What I wanted was different, cooler, deeper, something that his charm or his spin doctors would not erase. I wanted a kind of justice that lived in facts. So I started collecting facts. I went back through months of old messages, saved voicemails, contracts, and screenshots of conversations where he'd promised me things he never intended to keep. I dug up emails, those tiny, professional things that so often hide the real work behind success, the ones I had written at 3 a.m, when we were both exhausted, when I set up meetings, negotiated small favors, convince people to give him a chance. I found bank statements showing where I had paid for studio time, when I had covered travel, the nights I'd fronted meals and equipment without him, so much as offering to reimburse me. Each paper I found felt like pulling a thread from a sweater until the whole pattern started to unravel. It surprised me how many things he'd left in plain sight. Maybe he had learned to perform for crowds, but he had never perfected lying to himself. There were receipts with his name on the guest lists I paid for, and recordings where producers thanked me, not him, for arranging the session. There were contracts where my contributions were omitted, carefully edited out as if credit were a commodity to be hoarded. I printed everything, not because I wanted to treasure the pain, but because I wanted to hold proof in my hand. When you are making a case against someone who built an empire of image, you need a scaffold made of documents. Then I called an old acquaintance, a lawyer who worked with artists when things turned ugly. Not out of a desire to sue. I didn't want court headlines that would make me seem bitter or petty, but because lawyers have a way of translating personal betrayals into professional leverage. They know which letters to send, which clauses to reference, and how to make the people around an accused person uneasy enough to ask questions. He was discreet, efficient, and blunt. After I explained calmly with dates and references, he told me exactly what I needed to do next. Gather witnesses, back up everything to multiple secure locations, and avoid doing anything that could be spun as harassment. Witnesses were the trickiest part. People don't like getting involved. They fear lawsuits, public drama, or the social fallout of taking a side. But what I found surprised me. Small kindnesses that had once been passed off as favors came with memories that could anchor a story. A bartender who'd given him his first paid gig remembered who had introduced him. A sound engineer who'd let us into the studio recalled the nights I stayed late to help fix vocals. A promoter who'd posted his first proper show remembered my emails. I met with him quietly over coffee in places where no one would notice. I asked them to recount the facts as they remembered them and to sign simple statements confirming that I had been instrumental behind the scenes. None of them wanted to ruin a life. They just wanted to be truthful. While I assembled people and paperwork, I also thought about how to make the truth matter. In the age of headlines and short attention spans, a raw claim from an ex can be drowned out by celebrity spin. I didn't want that. I wanted something that demanded attention, not because it was loud, but because it was undeniable. So I made a dossier, neat, professional, and clinical. It wasn't emotional. It didn't read like a diary. It read like a report. Dates, names, emails, screenshots with timestamps, voice notes with clear beginnings and ends. A timeline that showed the arc of his rise, and in parallel, my investment in it. And as I folded the dossier into a locked folder, I felt something subtle shift inside me. The rage that had once been all-consuming cooled into a steady resolve. There's a strange kind of power in order. When chaos seizes you, setting a row of papers straight can feel like winning a small battle. It calmed me. It made me strategic. It turned a raw wound into a plan. Choosing where to place that dossier was its own battle. I could have posted everything online in a ranting manifesto, but anyone could dismiss that as an act of revenge. I needed someone who understood the industry, someone who would verify, someone with the patience to look beyond scandal and examine the structures that created the illusion. So I reached out to a reporter I'd met once at a panel. Maya, she was the kind of journalist who cared more about truth than clickbait. She had written pieces about how record labels wash costs through small companies, about the people whose names were missing from the credits. Her byline carried weight. If she believed me, the story wouldn't be a rumor. It would be a report. I remember writing the email like it was a ritual. I attached a brief note, not angry, not pleading, just a concise outline of the facts and an offer to meet. Then I waited, and waiting was its own kind of torture. You imagine the worst, you imagine the best, and both possibilities make your stomach turn. When she replied, her message was professional and surprisingly human. Bring what you have. Let's talk. That small sentence felt like the first genuine breath of possibility I'd taken in months. Meeting Maya was oddly cathartic. She listened without judgment, taking notes, asking precise questions about timelines and contacts. She asked where I got certain records, how I knew the people I named, and whether the first feared retaliation. Her questions were practical and piercing, and I answered them all honestly. I saw in her not a hunger for scandal, but a hunger for systems, how artists get packaged, who profits, and who gets written out. She promised to verify what she could independently, to reach out to the people I named, and to be cautious with wording. I liked that. Caution meant credibility. While Maya did her work, the world of Ryan continued to orbit the same temptations. He posted glowing photos from show after show, smiling in a way that still turned heads. He accepted interviews where he gave the polished version of the story, the self-made star, the hardworking musician who rose from nothing. That public face was what people bought into. But behind those photos, cracks were forming that even he couldn't polish with a grin. When Maya called to tell me she had corroborated key facts, I felt a cold thrill. She had spoken to a promoter I'd named, who confirmed my emails. She had a producer who admitted that my introduction had begun the chain of connections. She had bank transfers verified. It wasn't everything. Legal processes would be slow and thorough, but it was enough to build a narrative. She told me she would publish a piece that laid out the facts, included documents, and asked the label and management directly for comment. She cautioned me this would change things, and not always in the way people hope. Are you prepared for him to fight back? She asked. I was. I told her I was prepared for the truth to be messy. When the article went live, it was a quiet avalanche. The headline wasn't sensational. It was factual, with a tone that forced readers to consider the systems at play rather than the melodrama of a breakup. The piece showed how artists' careers can be built by people who never receive credit, how funds can be moved quietly, and how narratives are curated to hide the labor behind the celebrity. It quoted documents, it printed small portions of contracts, and it contained statements from the people I'd interviewed. It also included my statement, short, factual, and calm. I'd written it that way on purpose. Fury is easy. Credibility requires restraint. The reaction was immediate and complex. Ryan's feed erupted with angry speculation. His loyal fans rallied with hashtags and messages, insisting he was being targeted. He posted a video that night, looking exhausted and hurt, claiming misunderstandings and mischaracterizations. He didn't name me directly, but he painted a familiar picture, a betrayed artist, betrayed by someone who couldn't handle his success. It was the same tactic he had always used: appeal to sympathy, muddy the waters, and hope the public chooses the narrative that feels easiest to believe. But while his fans argued in comment sections, other things happened that could not be swayed by spin. A festival reached out to the label and asked for clarification. Sponsors put negotiations on hold. A radio show postponed an upcoming interview. Contracts that were once taken for granted entered a limbo where lawyers and PR teams began to measure risk more carefully. Reputation is a business currency as much as it is an emotional one. And suddenly, Ryan's balance sheet was showing red. He lashed out publicly, long live streams, sharp words, and pleas for his followers to stand by him. He tried to rally support, painting himself as wronged, and in front of some fans, it worked. But in the rooms where deals were made, the reaction was different. Managers and sponsors don't want chaos. They don't want to be dragged into legal disputes that could harm their brands. What they want is stability. And in the face of real documents and public inquiry, stability was in question. A promoter who had once booked him called me, not to gloat, but to ask practical questions. "Do you want anything?" she asked. "Are you looking for money for credit?" Her tone was not accusatory. It was pragmatic. She was assessing the situation like a project. At that moment, everything felt oddly clinical. The emotional wound turned into a professional problem that needed solutions. I didn't ask for money. I didn't need it to hurt him. I wanted recognition. I wanted the truth. Ryan's response escalated in predictable and painful ways. He posted a rebuttal full of emotion and vague denials. He tried to threaten legal action. He reached out to people who had spoken to Maya and attempted to intimidate them into silence. There were anonymous messages and attempts to discredit witnesses. He ruined friendships that had been thin to begin with, burning bridges in a frantic effort to anchor himself. But the more frantic he became, the more unstable he appeared. It was painfully ironic. Someone who had built an empire on performance was unraveling when the cameras stayed off. Then came the smaller public shifts that felt like 1,000 paper cuts. A label delayed a release. A brand pulled back from a campaign. A radio interview was canceled with a terse corporate-sounding message. None of these moves was dramatic on its own. They were quiet, like a gallery removing his painting from display without explaining why. But together, they created a pattern. Opportunities dried up, not because people wanted to punish him, but because working with someone under scrutiny posed a risk. Watching his world shrink was not a thrill like I'd imagined. There was a hollow in me that neither his ruin nor my preparation could fill. I had thought naively that exposing him would unburden me. Instead, it unspooled more complicated threats, witnesses who feared for their livelihoods, mutual friends caught between loyalties, and the ugly satisfaction that felt too easy. There were nights I questioned whether I'd done the right thing. Revenge felt righteous when the proof was laid bare, but it also forced me to confront a truth I had avoided. Much of my life had been spent inside someone else's possibility, and by focusing so intensely on dismantling his, I had postponed rebuilding my own. Still, the machinery had been set in motion. He could rant, he could threaten, he could flail and try to smear me, but the dossier existed. His name was being scanned by people who mattered in ways that comments could not reach. The truth had weight, and even if the public didn't immediately cheer my side, institutions reacted. That reaction was quieter, but it hurt more. It was the kind of hurt that removed comfort and replaced it with reality. In the quieter hours, when the dust settled and the immediate aftermath had passed, I had time to think. Revenge had been a sharp tool, but now that it had been used, I realized I had to decide what to build with the space it created. Destroying him didn't automatically build me. That was a revelation I hadn't expected, and it shaped the next part of my life in ways that would matter more than any vindication. Asterisk, he didn't go quietly, of course. People like Ryan never do. When the lights begin to dim, when the applause starts to fade, they claw for every shred of attention left. He turned to the only weapon he knew how to wield: his voice, not in song, but in smear. It started with subtle digs, little comments slipped into live streams or interviews. He never said my name, but the descriptions were pointed, barbed enough that anyone who had followed us from the beginning could piece together who he meant. "Some people can't stand to see you succeed," he'd say, eyes heavy with false sadness. Or, "I trusted someone once, thought they were in it for the art, but they were really just in it for themselves." His words dripped with implication, and his fans, always eager to protect him, latched onto those hints. Like matches to gasoline, anonymous messages filled my inbox. Some were cruel, accusing me of being bitter, jealous, talentless. Others were mocking, sending laughing emojis under posts I made about my own small projects. For a moment, the tide of it made me want to disappear, to delete every account, to shrink until I couldn't be seen or touched. That was what he wanted, to scare me into silence so he could control the narrative again. But here's the thing about lies. They don't survive long when the ground beneath them is shifting. His words carried heat, but they carried no substance. The dossier I had built, the article Maya had published, the whispers now circulating through industry back rooms, those had weight. His accusations were smoke, and smoke only lingers if no wind comes to clear it. The wind came in the form of his own desperation. He began to rant longer, lash out harder, argue with strangers in his own comment sections. He threatened lawsuits that never materialized because his lawyers knew the evidence was too strong. He tried to bait me into responding publicly to give him a foil to fight against. But I stayed quiet. That silence was more powerful than any argument. It made him look unhinged, as if he were shadowboxing with ghosts. Meanwhile, the calls and emails he once bragged about stopped coming. A manager who had championed him quietly cut ties, saying only that scheduling conflicts made future projects impossible. A brand he courted scrubbed his photos from their social pages without explanation. A festival that had billed him as a headliner released a new poster with his name gone, replaced by someone newer, fresher, less controversial. Each loss drove him to shout louder. And the louder he shouted, the smaller he looked. The industry is cruel that way. It doesn't care about your heartbreak, your excuses, your attempts to spin a story. It only cares about what you can sell. And if you start costing more than you bring in, the doors close one by one. For me, those days were both terrifying and strangely liberating. Terrifying because I still felt his shadow whenever I opened my laptop, wondering what new barrage might be waiting. Liberating because for the first time, I wasn't reacting out of fear. I was observing. Watching him unravel didn't bring me the giddy satisfaction I once thought it would. It brought clarity. He wasn't powerful anymore. He was loud. And loud without power is just noise. In the middle of his noise, I found quiet spaces to return to myself. I pulled out my old notebooks, pages filled with lyrics I had abandoned years earlier because I thought they didn't fit his vision. I sat at my keyboard late at night, playing melodies that had nothing to do with his sound. At first, it was awkward, like learning to breathe again after being underwater too long. But slowly, it became natural. The music wasn't perfect. It wasn't polished. But it was mine, and maybe that was the greatest shift of all. While he flailed, screaming into the void, I was reclaiming pieces of myself he had stolen without even realizing it. My voice, my words, my silence. His storm didn't destroy me. It destroyed him. The collapse didn't come all at once, like a tower crumbling in a single explosion. It came the way most collapses do, slow at first, then all at once. The cracks had been spreading for weeks, maybe months, and though he kept plastering over them with a grin and a song, the foundation beneath him was already rotting. At first, the losses were small enough that he thought he could recover. A sponsor dropped him, but he told his fans he was moving toward independent branding. A tour date was canceled, but he blamed venue complications. A collaboration with a bigger artist never materialized, and he explained it away as creative differences. On the surface, his excuses sounded reasonable. To someone scrolling casually, they might even seem true. But behind the scenes, the air around him grew toxic. I heard it through whispers, the way you always do in circles that overlap but don't fully touch. Friends of friends, producers who knew other producers, assistants who saw too much and said just enough after a drink. He's unstable, the label's not happy. No one wants to risk it right now. It was always said in hushed tones because no one wanted to be quoted. But the meaning was clear. His name was no longer a guarantee of anything. He must have felt it too, because his behavior changed. Gone was the cool, untouchable Ryan who knew how to charm a room. In his place was someone frantic, calling old contacts and begging for favors he once would have sneered at. He started showing up at events he hadn't been invited to, forcing himself into conversations with people who politely excused themselves. He doubled his posts online, desperate to prove he was still relevant, still adored. But attention born of desperation has a different taste. It's sour, and everyone notices. One night, I saw a clip someone had reposted of him performing at a small club. Not a theater, not a festival stage. A club so small Fave camera caught nearly the entire room in a single frame. His voice cracked as he tried to belt out a song that once filled arenas. The crowd clapped politely, but the energy wasn't adoration, it was curiosity, maybe even pity. The Ryan who had strutted across stages like he owned the air itself was gone. What remained was a man trying to claw his way back up a cliff that had already crumbled beneath him. I should have felt triumphant, but instead I felt a strange heaviness. Watching him shrink wasn't the high I thought it would be. It was sobering, almost haunting. This was someone who had once convinced the world and me that he was unstoppable. Now he was just a man, fragile and desperate, stripped of the shine that had made him seem untouchable. While he spiraled downward, I kept moving quietly upward. I didn't make a spectacle of it. I wasn't chasing spotlights anymore. I was rebuilding brick by brick. I started sharing little pieces of music online, not flashy singles, just raw demos, simple songs that sounded like me, not like a watered-down echo of his style. To my surprise, people listened. Not millions, not thousands even, but enough. Enough to remind me that I had a voice. Enough to remind me that I was more than the role he had written me into. Found joy in small victories, finishing a song I didn't hate. Getting a kind comment from someone I'd never met. Reconnecting with friends I'd neglected during the years I had spent orbiting him. Each step was tiny, almost invisible compared to the dramatic implosion of his career. But together, they built something solid. For the first time in years, I wasn't chasing. I was creating, and maybe that was the most painful part for him, while his name was fading from the billboards and playlists. Mine was slowly, steadily returning to life. Not because of scandal, not because of headlines, but because I refused to stop. He was fading, and I was rising, not in fame maybe, but in freedom. He had once taken everything I had and used it to build himself higher. Now, even as his world collapsed, he couldn't take this from me. Because I had finally learned the truth. The greatest revenge isn't destroying someone else's life. It's proving they could never destroy yours. The quiet after the storm felt strange at first. For so long, my days had been filled with noise, his noise, the chaos of his world, the constant push and pull of his rise and fall. When it finally went silent, I didn't quite know what to do with it. I would wake up expecting a message, a headline, a new smear, some ripple of his existence reaching for me. But there was nothing, just stillness, and in that stillness, I began to breathe again. Life no longer revolved around his shadow. I didn't measure my worth by whether he noticed me, credited me, or tried to destroy me. I measured it by smaller, softer things. Waking up without dread pressing against my ribs, I sat down at my keyboard and played without thinking of whether the melody would please him. Smiling at the thought of a future that belonged to me, not to someone who only saw me as a stepping stone, the world eventually moved on from him. That was the cruelest part of his downfall. I think not the anger, not the gossip, but the indifference. His name stopped trending. His songs stopped playing. His face disappeared from interviews and posters, replaced by fresher voices, newer dreams. He had lived for the sound of applause, and when it finally faded, there was nothing left to anchor him. He became a ghost in the very industry that once bowed at his feet. I didn't watch closely anymore. I didn't need to. Knowing he was gone from the spotlight was enough. My story no longer depended on his absence or presence. My story was mine to tell, mine to shape. I poured myself into rebuilding, not as a grand statement, but as a quiet reclamation. I wrote songs about healing, about betrayal, about love, not romantic love, but love for myself, for the parts of me I had abandoned. I performed in small rooms, the kind where the lights are warm and the audience actually listens. And when they clapped, it wasn't polite pity. It was a connection, real and simple. One night after a show, a young girl came up to me. She told me my song made her feel seen, that it gave her courage to walk away from someone who treated her as less than she deserved. I smiled and thanked her, but inside, I felt something break open, a realization that my pain, once so heavy, had been transformed into something that could help someone else stand taller. That was worth more than revenge ever could be. Looking back, I see it clearly now. Betrayal may break you, but it doesn't define you. What defines you, the choices you make afterward? I could have stayed in the wreckage of what he did to me. I could have let his lies, his greed, his shadows shape the rest of my life. But I didn't. I chose to rise. I chose to rebuild. I chose myself, and that is the lesson I carry with me. The one I hope anyone listening remembers. The greatest revenge isn't in ruining someone else's life. It's in proving they can't ruin yours, because in the end, he faded into silence while I found my voice again. And that voice, my voice, is something no betrayal, no storm, no collapse can ever take away.